The dirty little secret about moving to the Big Apple is every generation gets sold a version of New York that no longer exists. Yes, your parents heard stories about cheap East Village apartments and artists squatting in SoHo lofts. And your grandparents remember when the Bronx was affordable and Brooklyn was for working families. But each generation arrived chasing a city that had already vanished, replaced by something more expensive and exclusive than what came before. Yet Generation Z faces something different. A New York that has become mathematically impossible rather than merely difficult. Indeed, this isn't about grit or hustle anymore. When studio apartments cost more than your entire monthly take-home pay before you've bought groceries or paid student loans, the equation doesn't balance no matter how you slice it. The cruelest part is that the mythology persists. Social media feeds overflow with curated glimpses of young people living their best New York lives. But the reality behind those carefully framed shots involves family money, inherited wealth, or unsustainable debt that will eventually come due. Today's episode examines why the city that built its reputation on welcoming broke dreamers has become a fortress accessible only to those who arrive already wealthy. For decades, New York City was where a young American could arrive with little more than a suitcase and a dream and still find a foothold. But for Generation Z, the cohort born between 1997 and 2012, that foothold has crumbled into an impossibility. What once required grit and hustle now demands inherited wealth, corporate-level salaries, or a willingness to endure financial ruin. The mathematics alone make the case. In 2025, the median asking rent in New York hit $3,397. A studio averaged $3,274. A one-bedroom commanded $4,045. In Manhattan, those figures were higher still. Studios around $4,200, one-bedrooms $5,242. Now, put those numbers against the income of a typical Gen Z worker in New York, $42,258 per year. After taxes, that leaves about $2,800 per month. Not enough to rent even the smallest studio before groceries, utilities, or transportation are counted. The affordability mismatch is stark. Financial experts recommend spending no more than 30% of gross income on housing. For Gen Z in New York, that equals roughly $1,055 per month. There is not a single neighborhood in the city where that budget secures even a basement apartment. This is not just about numbers. It is about the crushing psychological weight that comes with them. Nearly half of Gen Z report uncontrollable financial anxiety. More than half describe their financial situation as fair or worse. The daily math of surviving New York translates directly into chronic stress and deferred life choices. The challenges compound. Student loan payments average $526 a month for Gen Z borrowers, the highest of any generation. Family wealth has become the hidden subsidy. Nearly half of Gen Z New Yorkers rely on financial help from parents, with support averaging $1,813 a month. Without that safety net, the dream evaporates. Social media makes matters worse. YouTube and TikTok drip with curated content of young creatives in chic East Village apartments, but the reality behind the camera is parental financing, inheritance, or unsustainable debt. The illusion is seductive. The reality is exclusionary. Even those who secure above-average salaries face a losing equation. The cost of living for a single person in New York averages $4,130 per month, excluding rent. Combine that with Manhattan's median studio rent of $4,200, and survival requires an annual pre-tax income above $150,000, a figure far beyond the grasp of entry-level creatives, service workers, or junior professionals. The great irony is that the very generation raised on the mythology of New York, the city of opportunity, culture, and reinvention, is systematically priced out of its streets. And so the dream of making it in New York has shifted from an attainable gamble to a rigged game, where the buy-in alone eliminates most of a generation before they even get started. The city that once welcomed broke poets and struggling actors has become something else entirely. And to understand how we got here, we have to throw it back to the era when New York was still a bohemian bargain. In the 1960s, New York was rough around the edges but alive with possibility. The median national rent was $71 in 1960, and even in Manhattan, entire blocks of industrial lofts stood empty. SoHo was derisively known as Hell's 100 Acres, a neighborhood scarred by warehouse fires and considered a last resort for anyone with options. For artists, that meant cheap space and freedom to experiment. Painters like Alice Neal and filmmakers like Jack Smith carved out lives in vast lofts that rented for a fraction of today's prices. A building that sold for $30,000 in 1960 could command $150,000 by 1970, but even those gains look quaint against the astronomical figures that would follow. New York's accessibility wasn't simply about low rents, it was about neglect. Between 1965 and 1974, the city abandoned 200,000 housing units, and tax delinquency left landlords walking away from buildings. Manufacturing jobs were fleeing, crime was rising, and middle-class families were decamping to the suburbs. The void created a peculiar kind of freedom. For young creatives, this freedom became the foundation of New York's myth. Neighborhoods like SoHo, the East Village, and Tribeca offered cavernous spaces for pennies on the dollar. Communities of painters, musicians, and writers filled the vacuum, building cultural legacies that would later define global art and music scenes. The 1970s sharpened this paradox. The city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy in 1975. Between 1969 and 1976, it lost 1,000 manufacturing firms annually, shedding 500,000 industrial jobs. Population decline approached 1 million people, leaving entire neighborhoods hollowed out. Yet, in the cracks of this collapse, opportunity flourished. Housing prices citywide actually fell by 12.4%, with Manhattan an exception where values rose 29%. That divergence foreshadowed the city's future, but at the time it still meant artists could find space. Even policy reflected the crisis. In 1971, the state passed vacancy decontrol, removing rent protections from apartments once tenants moved out. Though the law was quickly reversed, it set a precedent that would echo through the decades, treating housing as a commodity, not a necessity. What mattered in the moment, however, was that a generation of artists and dreamers could still arrive with little money and carve out lives in New York. The very decay that drove others away created an urban canvas for experimentation. The irony is that the grit and neglect of these decades built the reputation that still lures young people to New York today, long after the affordability that enabled it has disappeared. The slow unraveling of affordable New York was not simply the march of time, it was the outcome of deliberate choices by powerful actors in politics and finance. The fiscal crisis of 1975 set the stage. Facing bankruptcy, the city turned to bankers and state officials for rescue. Their conditions transformed New York's priorities, putting debt repayment and investor confidence above neighborhood survival. This shift cemented a new governing philosophy. The city would be managed for financial stability, not accessibility. The 1980s accelerated this transformation. Wall Street entered its boom years, and with it came the financialization of housing. Between 1980 and 1989, sale prices citywide rose 152%. In 18 neighborhoods, they climbed more than 200%. Real estate was no longer simply shelter, it was an investment vehicle, a storehouse for capital. Policies reinforced this change. The Urstadt Law blocked New York City from enacting stronger rent regulation than the state, stripping local leaders of the ability to protect tenants. Luxury deregulation rules later allowed landlords to remove apartments from regulation once rents passed certain thresholds. Each change tilted the balance further away from affordability and toward speculation. The mortgage market added another layer. Interest rates spiked to 18.45% in 1981, then fell, igniting a wave of development finance through complex new instruments. Housing became entwined with global finance, vulnerable to the same cycles of boom and bust. The effects rippled through culture. Artists who once rented SoHo lofts for a song watched as corporate tenants and tech startups outbid them. The very neighborhoods built by bohemian communities became unaffordable to the people who had given them life. By the 1990s, Silicon Alley emerged, centered around the Flatiron District. Tech firms leased millions of square feet annually, competing directly with galleries and creative spaces. When DoubleClick signed for 150,000 square feet on West 33rd Street in 1999, it signaled that technology companies could pay premium rents in areas once dominated by working-class residents and artists. Government leaders embraced this transformation. Mayor Michael Bloomberg's administration in the 2000s actively courted finance and technology, championing developments like the Cornell Tech campus. The strategy succeeded in attracting wealth but also entrenched inequality. Luxury amenities like the High Line boosted property values while pricing out long-time residents. At the same time, foreign capital flooded in. Manhattan condos became vaults for overseas wealth, purchased in cash by oligarchs, bankers, and international investors. By the 20s, as much as 18% of high-end condo transactions involved foreign nationals. Entire towers rose more for investment portfolios than for living communities. Each of these choices, deregulation, courting global capital, privileging finance, pushed New York further from its identity as a city for strivers. The dream of affordable reinvention gave way to a metropolis optimized for speculation. The trajectory was clear. The very forces that saved New York from collapse were the same forces that would later make it impossible for a new generation to live there. The escalation of costs in New York was less a gentle incline and more an unrelenting climb. By the 2000s, rents and sale prices detached completely from local incomes. The national median rent had been just $243 in 1980. By 1985, it jumped to $432, a 78% leap in 5 years. In New York, the increases were even sharper. Real estate values rose beyond what most working residents could support, but the demand from investors and high earners kept climbing. The luxury boom magnified this spiral. The gallery exodus from SoHo to Chelsea in the 1990s showed how cultural institutions were displaced by rising rents. By 2001, blue-chip dealers like Pace Wildenstein and Matthew Marks had established Chelsea strongholds, only to face another round of skyrocketing costs by the 2000s. Galleries then decamped to Brooklyn, with Bushwick emerging as a cheaper alternative. But even those havens succumbed to the same cycle of rising values, leaving artists in a perpetual state of displacement. Foreign capital reshaped the market further. Manhattan condos became magnets for international money in the 2000s, as buyers from China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and Germany funneled wealth into luxury towers. By the mid-2020s, foreign nationals accounted for up to 18% of high-end condo transactions. Buildings like 157 and Central Park Tower became less about homes and more about bank vaults in the sky. Many left dark as absentee owners treated them as assets rather than communities. The gig economy did not offset these trends, it reinforced them. By the 20s, nearly 60% of New Yorkers engaged in freelance or app-based side work, but the average payout from such hustles hovered around $200 per month. In a city where the cost of living excluding rent surpassed $4,100 monthly, side hustles provided only a band-aid on a gaping wound. Rent regulation had once offered stability, but decades of erosion hollowed out its impact. Vacancy decontrol, luxury deregulation, and the Urstadt law combined to shrink the pool of regulated units dramatically. New construction remained almost entirely market rate. The result was a two-tier system. Those lucky enough to hold regulated apartments clung to affordability, while everyone else faced a brutal open market. For newcomers, the mismatch became impossible to ignore. In 2025, a studio averaged $3,274. A one-bedroom averaged $4,045. In Manhattan, the numbers were worse. Studios at $4,200, one-bedrooms at $5,242. Against a Gen Z median income of $42,258, the gap was insurmountable. The numbers were only part of the story. Infrastructure and services groaned under the weight of costs. Health insurance premiums soared, childcare expenses drained paychecks, and utilities like electricity and internet added hundreds to monthly bills. Financial independence became elusive even for those with jobs paying above the median. This was no longer the city of cheap lofts and creative abundance. It was a marketplace where survival required wealth before arrival. The costs had not just risen, they had broken the very premise of New York as a city where anyone could begin again. For Generation Z, New York has ceased to be a proving ground and instead become a fortress with walls too high to scale. The math leaves no room for illusion. A 24-year-old graduate landing a creative industry job at $55,000 annually takes home about $3,600 per month after taxes. A studio apartment costs $3,274. Utilities, transit, and groceries add nearly $700 more. Before health insurance or student loans are even counted, they are already in the red. Student debt makes the gap unbridgeable. Gen Z borrowers pay an average of $526 per month, the highest of any generation. With loan balances growing faster than their incomes, more than 80% of young borrowers delay buying homes, and over 70% make job choices based on repayment obligations. Debt has become not just a financial weight, but a structural barrier to independence. Family wealth now decides who survives. 46% of Gen Z adults rely on financial help from parents, averaging $1,813 per month. This subsidy covers groceries, health care, and most critically, rent. On social media, young New Yorkers flaunt East Village apartments and curated lifestyles, but the real story is family money propping up independence. Without that cushion, the illusion collapses. The psychological consequences are severe. Nearly half of Gen Z report excessive anxiety tied to money. More than half describe their finances as poor or precarious. Concepts like doom spending, making impulsive purchases because the future feels unattainable, capture the despair of a generation shut out from milestones their parents once took for granted. Even those who should be thriving are leaving. Between 2022 and 2023, more than 481,000 people left New York for other states, with Florida and New Jersey leading the list of destinations. The most frequent demographic among leavers? Young professionals under 35 making six figures. The city is not only losing those at the margins, it is losing the very talent base it depends on. Philadelphia offers a telling counterpoint. Housing costs are 58% lower, while salaries are only about 14% lower. Local purchasing power in Philadelphia is 43% higher than in New York. For many, this difference means the ability to save, invest, and live without suffocating financial anxiety. What remains in New York is a narrowing pipeline. Those with family wealth enter the city with a financial cushion. Those without must accept debt, unsafe housing, or departure. This bifurcation is eroding the very diversity that once made New York thrive. The city that built its reputation on being a meritocratic stage where ambition could triumph regardless of background has been hollowed out. For Generation Z, the American dream of New York is no longer a struggle worth taking on. It is a dream recast as an impossibility, where the curtain has already fallen before the play even begins. And now we'd like to see you in the comments. Are you a New Yorker? And if so, do you agree with this video? We look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for joining us for another episode.